Welcome to another episode of the Doctors Building Wealth podcast. Today, Kenji and I are going to be talking about the other half of the transaction, which is mastering the sale of your investment property. And this is something not a lot of people talk about. Usually people talk about buying properties, finding new properties, scaling your portfolio, and we spend a lot of time talking about that too. But today we really wanted to focus on how do you sell your investment property? How do you decide when you sell your investment property? How do you successfully go about selling your investment property? And so that's what we talking about in the podcast.
Yeah, and the way we buy properties is we buy and hold. And I think one of the things that has happened over the last several years with 100% bonus depreciation is that people were incentivized to sell. And so what we've done is we've actually sold a number of our properties, many of which we thought we were going to hold on to for a long time, but we actually sold them because we wanted to scale up and also take advantage of that 100% bonus depreciation. When you scale up and you buy these bigger properties, you can create these massive losses and shelter a lot of income. And that's how we were able to shelter our income for 7 years in a row.
Yeah, I have to say we were actually writing about all the property exchanges that we were doing, how many we were selling, what we were buying. We did this for a long time with our blog. And so you can see our year in review articles if you go to semiretiredmd.com. And if you want to go deeper into the properties we sold and our learnings from those properties, because when we were writing those blog posts, we were actually talking about what we were learning from each sale. So if you listen to this podcast and you're like, hey, I really want to go deeper, definitely go to our blog and look at our year in review and be able to see those.
Yeah, and then just reflecting on my experience, not just all the properties that we've sold together, I can go back to 2001 and think about properties that I bought back then and then sold a number of properties during the run-up between 2002 and 2006. I was buying and selling a whole bunch of properties, mostly land was what I was buying and selling. And the turnaround was really quick. I would buy a property, sell it within 3 to 6 months because you get this crazy appreciation back then. And so just reflecting on all the properties that I've sold over the years since 2001, it's been, I can't even think, I didn't actually do an actual count, but dozens and dozens of properties.
It's been a lot. It's been a lot, even just together in the last few years. One of the things I really want to highlight for all of you guys who are maybe earlier on in your journey and are like, oh, selling, that's not for me. It's not important to me yet. I'm still growing my portfolio. Actually, you really want to listen to this episode and learn how to sell because it actually will help you know what the seller's psychology is and know what the seller is looking for and actually be a better negotiator as a buyer of any property. We have learned so much by selling our properties about how our motivations as sellers, and it's helped us be better buyers because we take more time to really understand what it's like to be a seller and what are the motivations that are leading people to sell.
Yeah, and it may be hard to kind of explain, but if you really understand what the seller is going through and you feel this when you're on the other side. And just to give you a real life example, I remember we were selling a property and the buyer came at us and wanted $1,000 discount on the property. And I remember saying there was no reason to give a discount because there were multiple offers on this property. But as we sat there, we're like, are we going to lose this thing for $5,000 and have to go through that whole process again of listing the property and notifying the tenants and then going through all the different offers and then going through this whole due diligence process with the inspection. And ultimately, what you don't understand if you haven't gone through the sales process is that whole process can be fairly exhausting. It's a lot of effort involved. And so when somebody comes at you with a $5,000 request for a discount and you're just kind of like, I'm not going to lose this over $5,000.
Well, not only that, we were in a 1031 exchange. So they actually took advantage of knowing that we were in a bit of a time crunch and we were very, very motivated to close on the property. And so they pretty much knew that we weren't going to say, oh, $5,000, we're going to go back to the drawing board and find somebody else because it would have put our 1031 exchange at risk. And so for that reason, they pretty much knew we were going to have to offer him the $5,000. And like he said, there were multiple offers on this property. We definitely could have gotten more. But, at that point, it was just like, of course, we're going to go through with it and just give him $5,000. It's just not worth it.
Well, that's a tip right there, right? Is that if you are on the buyer side, you want to find out if the seller is in a 1031 exchange. And if you're on the seller side, you don't want to reveal that you're in the middle of a 1031 exchange because that gives the buyer significant leverage having that piece of information. Now let's kind of dive in and talk about some of the things that we've learned selling all these properties over the years. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that when you're going to sell, you want to maximize the sales price. At least that's the key for us. And sometimes you might say, okay, I'm going to give up a little bit on price for speed, right? So especially if you're in a 1031 exchange, you might give up a little bit. But ultimately, what you're really going for when you're selling is you're maximizing the sales price. You want to get the most equity in the property out. And then if you're doing a 1031 exchange, that gives you the ability to take that equity and put it into the next property and scale up significantly.
Yeah, a lot of times we'll have people come to us and they'll say, well, should I, just sell my property as an off-market property, or should I try to sell it to the community? Should I take it into, we have a membership for our people who come out of Zero to Freedom called Empire Builders, and they say, well, can I just bring it and sell it to the Empire Builders? And we're always like, absolutely not. You do not want to sell it to experienced investors who are going to be looking for a haircut. You absolutely want to sell it to the inexperienced investor or the investor that has a little bit of emotional tie, or if it's a short-term rental, you want to sell it to a primary home buyer who's really emotionally invested in that property, because that's when you're going to be able to maximize that sales price. And why not maximize the sale price? Unless you have some reason that you need to close quickly, why wouldn't you maximize that sale price and be able to make the most of that deal and roll in as much as you can into the next deal?
Yeah, I think it's pretty funny, right? Because in Zero to Freedom, we teach you how to negotiate really well and how to negotiate aggressively and all these different tactics for doing so. And I guess when you're on the sales side, again, this is why we're doing this episode. This is so important, right? When you're on the seller side, you don't actually think about that, right? You need to also learn how to become a professional seller, not just a professional buyer. You need to really learn all the different tactics for selling at a maximum price.
Yeah, one of the things I love seeing, and it always makes me laugh a little bit, is when you're looking for listings. Let's say you're looking for small multifamily, and you'll see a listing and it'll say, this is the perfect owner occupied property. You can live in one side and you can rent out the other, and, live rent free or live for very low rent. And when an agent's writing that, what they're writing is, it's often an overpriced duplex. And they're like, okay, the numbers are not going to work if this person's just going to have, tenants in there, long-term tenants. Okay, how do I spin this to try to sell it at a higher price than really what it probably should be on market for? Okay, I'll offer it as owner occupied, right? Because if that person sees that picture of themselves personally occupying it, first of all, if it's owner occupied, they're going to get a lower interest rate, right? So they're going to be able to afford to pay a higher price, but also they're going to worry less about the other side and whether or not that property is truly going to cash flow, because they're living there for low rent or they're living there rent free, and they're not worrying about cash flow. And that's something that, as investors, like, we never want to buy a property at this overpriced price. We'd rather make sure that, even if we're going to own or occupy it, once we move out of it, we still want it to cash flow if we're renting it to regular tenants. And so I just think about how real estate agents like to spin it, and it's smart. Of course, it's smart because you take advantage of people's emotions. You take advantage of people who can get that lower interest rate, who want to own or occupy it. Great. But it's pure marketing strategy to set it up that way in the listing.
Yeah, and that's a great tactic, right? So if you're on the seller side, those are the types of tactics you want to take advantage of. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the types of buyers you're really going for. And if I think about, let's say, a primary home, what you're doing is you're looking for a primary home buyer who's going to just fall in love with your property, and they're going to pay. Price is not as important, right? They just envision themselves living in the property, and so they're willing to pay a much higher price. You're looking for those retail buyers. You're not looking for somebody who's trying to buy wholesale or at a discount. You're looking for somebody willing to pay that retail price, and oftentimes that's going to be a primary home buyer. And the example you just shared, duplex where you can live in one side, same thing, right? You're ultimately selling to somebody who is emotionally attached to this idea of living in one side of the duplex and having the renter pay for part of their mortgage, or maybe even living rent free, right? So that's a kind of a fun scenario for somebody who is a first-time home buyer, and a duplex is a really great way to get started. It's called a house hack, for those of you guys who don't know, and so that's a great way for somebody to maybe get started, and so that's another great scenario for you to get into.
I think about when we sold our house hack as well, we had a couple offers on that property. One was, first of all, a lady who wanted to buy it, but she couldn't get a loan because she had bought so many negative cash flowing properties that she no longer could get traditional financing for the property. So she obviously wasn't able to buy it, but that's just an example of a person who's investing, but they're buying negative cash flowing properties. And this was, back in like 2018. So if she was buying negative cash flowing properties back then, you can imagine, what situation she's in now. And then I think the other thing is we had a all cash buyer. The buyer who actually bought this property, that person was in a 1031 exchange. And I think they were in a time crunch. And at that point, they really just wanted to shelter some of their 1031 exchange money. They probably didn't shelter all of it because they paid cash for it, used all that money to put into that property. And they were just looking for parking their money in a property that was going to, make some cash flow for them, right? They were paying 100% of it. So of course it was going to cash flow. And they must have been in a time crunch to do that because they weren't actually doing that typical 1031 where they're growing, getting a bigger loan or, going and buying a bigger property that costs more money. And so sometimes people are in time crunches. Sometimes they just want to park their money. These are the really great investor type that you want to sell to, right? Because they're not as worried. And with that 100%, cash offer, that's a really great thing for you as a seller for security. And all of a sudden you understand why sellers really want all cash offers. We sold one of our short-term rentals probably about 6 months ago now, and we had 5 different offers, and 3 of them were all cash offers. And of course, those were right on the top of our list already because you get that increased certainty that the person is going to be able to close. And as a seller, you just don't want to be in limbo where somebody can't close and then you have to go through the process again, and then that person can't close, or that person tries to negotiate too much and you have to go through the process again. You don't want to be going through this process 2, 3, 4 times. You really want to have some certainty that the person's going to actually be able to buy that property. And cash, you start to understand why it's so attractive. And then you also start to understand that if somebody's giving a cash offer, they can actually give a little bit of a discount. Like, hey, we'll pay all cash, but we'll pay $5,000 or $10,000 less because you're like, oh, well, I have that increased certainty they're going to be able to close. It's probably worth $5,000 or $10,000 because I'm not going to have to go through this process multiple times. And so as a seller, you can start to see why cash is so good to offer when you're a buyer.
Yeah, and just to kind of talk about some other types of buyers that you might be looking for. So we talked about the emotional home buyer. You talked about somebody who might be wanting to house hack. Leti talked about somebody who's coming in with a cash offer, maybe under time pressure with a 1031 exchange. But the other couple types of people I can think about are inexperienced investors. And so somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, somebody who doesn't have the education, who's not necessarily looking for cash flow. Maybe they're looking for appreciation. So this would be another profile or type of buyer that you're looking for if you're a seller. And then I think the other one is going back to the cash offer. Some people are actually interested in just parking their money. And so I can think of foreign investors. A lot of them will come in. It may be more difficult for them to qualify for loans. So they're coming in with a lot of cash, and they come in and they buy your property in all cash. And they will cash flow, right? Because they don't have a mortgage. Oftentimes they will cash flow because, again, they don't have the mortgage payment. And so it's, again, another great situation if you're the seller to have a cash buyer. Now, we wanted to share some more tactics that you can use as a seller. And these tactics actually come from doing the opposite of what we teach in Zero to Freedom, right? What we teach in Zero to Freedom are different tactics for you to get a discount on these properties. And so what we're doing is we're now coming up with some strategies to counteract some of the things that buyers do to try to get that discount. What we're trying to do is prevent them from getting those discounts. And one of those is preventing them from locking up the property or getting the property under contract very quickly. And one way that you can do this is to set an offer review date. And an offer review date is you say, okay, this is the date I'm going to review all the different offers. And so usually it's about a week or 2 after you list the property. And this gives buyers a chance to review the property, potentially review even an inspection report, which we'll talk about in a little bit, maybe even review an inspection report, and then they're going to put in an offer on your property. And ideally, what you're doing is you're setting up a situation where you get multiple offers, and you can take your time to review those offers and then decide which one you want to choose. Sometimes what you also want to do is you want to take the best couple offers and then set up a bidding war situation where people are competing against each other to submit the best offer to you.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit more context because some of you guys might not be familiar with how we approach what we call locking it up. So normally what we do as buyers is we'll see a property, it'll pop up and we'll see it online. We see it very, very quickly. And we immediately call our agent. We immediately put in an offer. Ideally, we put in an offer within an hour of it popping up online. And we're putting in an offer if it's a great deal. And this only happens with really great deals. We're putting in an offer at price, or maybe we're even offering 5 or 10,000 more than the listing price. And what we're doing is we're saying, hey, you have 4 hours to accept this. We're doing something like that with time pressure because what we want them to do is say, oh my God, I have certainty here. I have the certainty that somebody wants to buy it. Let me just say yes, and then I'll feel good. Yeah, right? And so they're going for that immediately feel good, like dopamine rush of like, oh, I have the certainty this is under contract. And what they lose out on as a seller is they lose out on the opportunity to get, 12 different bids over the next couple days and then be able to weigh them and to be able to go back and forth. And you can't imagine how many sellers just jump on the first thing that comes because they just want that certainty. And especially if you're offering them a little bit higher than they even wanted, of course, they're going to be like that much more motivated. Well, again, what Kenji was mentioning is as when we're sellers, we don't want to do that. We actually oftentimes will get the inspection done ahead of time, especially for single family homes, especially works well with short-term rentals because these primary home buyers are very, very emotional. And they're not as savvy with the inspections. And so they may be more likely to accept the inspection. So we get the inspection done and then we give an offer review date, 48 or 72 hours later. And so we're not accepting any offers. And it kind of like we're saying up front, hey, we're not accepting any offers. We want to see all of them come in. Now, one of the keys with this methodology is you really want to have a good sales price, right? You don't want to have a sales price that's so crazy high that you're going to get one offer and it's not, or you might get 0 offers. Ideally, you're setting a decent price where you know you're going to get multiple offers. And that causes the anxiety in the side of the buyers. And they're like, oh my gosh, I have to put in an offer, but I have to put in an escalation clause. I got to go higher than that. I've got to give. And that's when you end up with that bidding war. Like I was talking about a short-term rental we sold in the last year. That property, we actually put out for $930,000 and it ended up getting, these 5 offers, 3 of which were cash offers. And then we could go back and forth and we got up over $1 million. Actually almost 100,000 more than what we put it in, but we put it in as a very reasonable price in order to facilitate that multiple offers. We're putting up one of our properties right now, also a short-term rental, also single family home, but we're actually pricing it pretty significantly high just to see what we can get. And so it's unlikely to have that multiple offer situation. And so we're not going this step. So you really have to be thoughtful about when it works, when it doesn't work, and also be thoughtful about your pricing of the property. But I think it's a really great way to create a bidding war, to maximize your sales price, and also to avoid the situation where somebody gets an inspection, finds some things, wants to negotiate against you, and then you're kind of making some concessions that you really didn't want to make because you had a great priced property that you put out there.
Yeah, I think pricing strategy it's a whole topic in itself, right? But getting that right price is absolutely essential. And as you said, it really depends on what you're going for. If you're going for a multiple bidding situation, if you're going just fishing for that really emotional buyer who's going to just be willing to pay top dollar. Again, this is a discussion that you're going to need to have with your agent, and that brings up another important point here, which is that you really need to be the one driving the bus. You really need to be the one deciding these things and leading the thinking around it. You have to define what it is that you want, what kind of situation you want to create. And so there's a real kind of important lesson here, which is that don't abdicate that responsibility to your agent. Don't let them be the one driving the bus and deciding these things. You really have to weigh in. You really have to drive this thinking and decide what it is that you want, and then develop the strategy from there.
I have to say, one of the things we've often done with 1031 exchanges too is when we find a property that we really like, we get it under contract, then we have enough properties in our portfolio and we're not emotionally tied to our properties. We could actually list multiple properties at higher prices, right? At prices that we're like, well, let's just see what happens. And we could put 3 or 4 properties on sale. And all we really need for the 1031 exchange is maybe 1 or maybe 2 of the properties to sell. But we're putting them out there at high prices, and we're going to see which one has a taker. And so that's also an opportunity, very similar and along the vein of this, of how you can decide on kind of looking to maximize your sales price, but doing so in a smart way that gives you lots of options once you have a big enough portfolio to be able to do that.
Now, there's so many other strategies and things that we could have discussed in this episode, but we really wanted to just give you a sense of how important it is to really learn the seller side of the transaction, right? This is half the transaction. If you're just focused on the buying side, you really are missing a whole other half. And then also, not only that, you're also missing all the learning that you can get from being on the sales side. It's going to help you become such a better buyer.
Yeah. And remember, if you can just take one takeaway from this, remember to, when you are buying a property, to think about the seller, to think about what it feels like to be in their shoes, to think about their psychology, to think about their motivations, to think about why they might be selling that property, what might be important to them in the sale. You know, do they want to maximize the price? Are they looking for speed? Like, why are they selling this property? Because the more you can put yourself into that seller's psychology, not only are you going to learn for your future trend, but you're going to be a lot more successful as a negotiator as well, because you're really taking the time to understand the other side. And that gives you leverage, because now you understand what's important to them, and you can set up a win-win situation where you're giving them what's important to them, but you're also finding ways to meet your own needs and your own values in the process to make it a win-win for both sides. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of the Doctors Building Wealth podcast, make sure to subscribe and share it with a friend. We'll see you next time.